Hey there everyone, it's Joe from Ainslie's Gold Silver Standard Insights, brought to you by goldsilverstandard.com and ainslieBullion.com.au. Today's topic is eye roll, US debt is unsustainable and will break the global economy. Now that's part 2 of our Are We Doomed to Repeat History series. Now, of course, that's posted on the Ainslie website. I'll post a link below for you to follow along. And we have Chris Tipper here to break down the article. And joining Chris today is the article's author, both part 1 and part 2, and coming up part 3, Alex Hutchinson from Siltech Precious Metals. So, Chris and Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. Back on Monday, we discussed part 1 of the journey Alex is taking us on around how the US dollar became the global reserve currency and where we are in terms of the chaos that system is creating, with it showing signs of becoming unfit for purpose in the current environment. In part 2, which was published this morning, we explore how the US government debt has continued to grow exponentially to the point where it is now completely unsustainable and looking ready to break the system entirely. Many would argue it's a miracle something hasn't broken already, but this is a very complex topic with lots of moving parts involved. So we're grateful to have Alex joining us again today to help break down some of this complexity. Thanks, Alex, and welcome back for the second time this week.
I had a few weeks missing, so happy to be back again.
Catching up, very good. Yeah. Can we start with a bit of a broad overview of just how much debt we're talking about here with this article today? Because I know when you look at the world economy and the world debt, we get some pretty mind-blowing numbers, but how much of that revolves around the US and probably more relevantly, the US dollar specifically?
So in the article today, we spoke about how the US debt has, I think it was the 3rd of October, hit 31 trillion, which was a new milestone. But if you looked at the article today, it's nearly at 31.2 trillion 16 days later. So that's nearly I think it's $151 billion spent by the US government in 16 days. So initially they were
shopping bill.
I don't know what they're spending it on, but I wouldn't mind spending it myself. So the world debt, it's now basically rising at an exponential rate, both the US and world debt. And you know, if you look at what carnage that's causing on the world economy, we've spoken about this before, is that the US is having to raise interest rates to combat inflation. That is therefore exacerbating how much money the US has to spend on its interest payments. So they're at about $93,000 per person for debt for every person in the US. I think you and I spoke about before that Russia's at $2,000 per person. So there's there's just such differentials in the world at the moment that that the phase that the world's entered into is you've got such extremes on both sides, like the US and Russia, that there's no fix. And what's going on is, you know, the US is, because the US is raising interest rates, people are buying more US dollars. Like the euro dollar market at the moment is requiring more US dollars to service what it's doing. And so whatever's happening in the US is happening in a multiplier effect around the world. So debt's just increasing at a rapid rate. So, you know, if the US now does enter a recession, which, I mean, we all think it is in recession, yeah, there's no way to depreciate their dollar anymore because there'll just be an increasing demand for US dollars across the world.
So the Fed's surely aware of that, right? Like they would obviously want to resolve this situation if there was a simple solution, and no one's suggesting that there is a simple solution. But the main tool in their arsenal is monetary policy. The problem that I have is that that's probably quite mismatched to the shocks that are impacting the economy right now. So my question would be, can they actually fix anything with the way that they're approaching it? Because, for example, if the concern is around factors that are effectively driven by fiscal policy or government spending, then does monetary policy, which is playing with interest rates, does that even solve that problem? Like if you've got they're really, in my mind, two quite independent beasts, aren't they?
Yeah, they are very independent. But what's actually happened over the last couple of years is both the Fed and the RBA and other central banks around the world have gotten in trouble for playing politics. So they were set up primarily to drive two things, most of them. inflation within a tight bracket, usually around 2 to 3%, and employment figures down. So that's what they were set up to do. Now, if you looked at what monetary policy has been used over the years, it was obviously driven through politics, because if there was an election coming up, we all know that the RBA would hold back interest rate rises till after the election. So they weren't necessarily independent. But what is very clear now is the Fed wants to be independent. So they've got one agenda now. It is to drive down interest rates, drive down inflation through interest rates or monetary policy. But right now, everything that is going on is fiscal shocks. So you've got the Ukraine war driving up energy prices. You've got climate change creating scarcity of food sources. And then you've got this massive government spend that happened over COVID, which is really coming home to roost. So you've now got these independent banks or central banks deciding to behave the right way, and you cannot treat fiscal shocks with monetary shocks effectively, with monetary policy effectively. And then you've also got the governments right now using fiscal policy to try and counter what's going on with these fiscal shocks, which is actually just exacerbating the issues worldwide.
And that's a little bit almost ironic, isn't it, that we've now got the central banks doing what they arguably should have been doing, and it's possibly, I think what you're saying there is it's really not the right time for them to be operating against each other. And we've seen the chaos that happens. Like we talked about that previously, the UK situation, where you do have the government and central bank not on the same page. It creates all sorts of chaos, because you can't do that without the markets going, well, this doesn't work. It's going to create turmoil that ultimately both the government and the central bank really should be there to resolve and to calm down.
And to work together. And
there is
absolutely. There's not a central bank in the world right now working with the governments, from what I can see. Actually, Bank of Japan, that was the other one. So Bank of Japan right now is probably the only bank in the world that is doing what the government needs it to do, which is not raise interest rates.
And heaven help us if we're using the Bank of Japan and the Japanese situation as the model here.
Imagine if inflation spikes in Japan. They've got debt of 260%. How can they pay anything back? And that's what's happening there. So
and no one can use Japan as a credible solution for this. So I suppose that leads into my question about, can this actually end differently this time? Because if we've got a different setup here from the past, it's going to require a new approach to resolve it. Like, as you've identified there, does it end differently?
Well, I mean, if you look at you're basically saying, can what the Fed is doing be effective? Can what any central bank in the world do right now be effective? Probably not. You've now got what is a global economy with, during COVID, everyone had the same problem. Now you've got the US with huge inflation. You've got China with no inflation, and they're pegged to the same dollar. So, what is going on in the world right now that you've got such hugely different scenarios going on? And we've got a time now where you've got the central banks now acting in the best solution for their countries, but we now have a globalized economy. So what one does for their own government right now and for their own economy has multiplying effects throughout the global economy.
Yes.
So, really, if you look at it, the Fed is the reserve global currency. They should be behaving in a global sense. They're not. So everything they do multiplies through to other countries. So, if the US is in recession and they do try to depreciate their dollar, that is just going to multiply through to the rest of the world, that other currencies are going, the volatility and turmoil that this is going to cause is going to be huge. And so I don't think there's a monetary federal government Federal Reserve solution that can come through. I think the world needs to start looking at what else they can do. It's very broken.
And that's not an encouraging answer, but like it's a reality, I suppose. So I think that really leads to a follow-on question from me. What is there anything at all we can do? So if we think about ourselves as individuals, this is all clearly being driven outside of our control by macro policy from governments, from central banks. So is there anything that you would suggest that we can do as individuals to protect ourselves, to prepare for that scenario? How do we go about that as individuals in this scenario?
Well, I guess if you look at what it is, we're basically talking about a fundamental distrust of currency, because no one is in control of this anymore. It's its own beast and it's doing its own thing. So, looking at commodities is probably a good place to go, because that in itself is its own currency. So gold, agricultural products, copper, they're their own commodity, they're their own currency, and it may be that that's the safest way to go at the moment.
And they might not be immune from volatility, because that is inevitable, but they are immune from the impact of printing and the impact of policy outside of that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Oh, well, thank you very much for digging in again on part 2, and one more part to go. So looking forward to that. I think we'll get that next week. So keen to continue this discussion then.
Thanks for having me again.
Thanks for being on the show again, Alex. We look forward to part 3. Chris, I'll see you on the next one. And for the audience, head over to the Discord channel. That's discord.gg/gold. Perfect place to continue the conversation. Chris will be there for the next 1 or 2 hours after the upload of this video. So head over there, ask your questions, get a response, and give us your feedback. We really want to hear from you. I want you to subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Ainslie Bullion, for the wide range of informational videos, including specials and more that we have on the channel 5 days a week. And while you're there, head over to goldsilverstandard.com, because that's bringing gold and silver into the digital world. As we say here at the end, balance your wealth in an unbalanced world. Take care, and we'll see you next time.